Hey everybody, this is the final video, I believe it's the 5th video, for Chapter 2 of Part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Part 3 of Negative Dialectics is titled Models. Chapter 2 of Part 3 is titled World Spirit and Natural History, and Excursion to Hegel. So let's rock. New section, quote, Natural History, quote. The objectivity of historic life is that of natural history. Marx, as opposed to Hegel, knew this and knew it strictly in the context of the universal that is realized over the subject's heads. Quote, even if a society has found its natural law of motion, and the present work's ultimate goal is to unveil the law of modern society's economic motion, natural evolutionary phases can be neither skipped nor decreed out of existence. I certainly do not depict the figures of capitalist and landowner in any rosy light, but this is a matter of persons only insofar as they personify economic categories, insofar as they are carriers of specific class relationships and interests. I comprehend the development of society's economic formation of society as a process of natural history. Less than any other does my standpoint permit holding the individual responsible for conditions whose social creature he remains, no matter how far he may subjectively rise above them. End quote. Marx. What is meant here is certainly not Feuerbach's anthropological concept of nature, against which Marx aimed dialectical materialism in the sense of a Hegelian reprise against the left Hegelians. Dialectical materialism was a term applied to Marxism after the fact by Plekhanov. The so-called law of nature that is merely one of capitalist society, after all, is therefore called, quote, mystification by Marx. Quote, actually expressed by the law of capitalist accumulation that has been mystified into a law of nature is thus only the fact that its nature excludes any decrease in the degree of labor exploitation, or any increase in the price of labor. What might seriously threaten the constant reproduction of the capital proportion, and its reproduction on a constantly widening scale. It cannot be different in a mode of production that has the worker exist for the need to utilize existing values, rather than the other way around, having objective wealth exist for the worker's need to develop, end quote. Marx. That law is natural because of its inevitable character under the prevailing conditions of production. Ideology is not superimposed as a detachable layer on the being of society. It is inherent in that being. It rests upon abstraction, which is of the essence of the barter process. Without disregard for living human beings, there could be no swapping. What this implies in the real progress of life to this day is the necessity of social semblance. Its core is value as a thing in itself. Value is, quote, nature. The natural growth of capitalist society is real, and at the same time it is that semblance. That the assumption of natural laws is not to be taken à la lettre. That least of all is it to be ontologized in the sense of a design, whatever its kind, of so-called, quote, man. This is confirmed by the strongest motive behind all Marxist theory, that those laws can be abolished. The realm of freedom would no sooner begin than they would cease to apply. By mobilizing Hegel's mediative philosophy of history, the Kantian distinction between a realm of freedom and a realm of necessity is transferred to the sequence of phases. Only to such a perverter of Marxian motives as Diamat, who prolonged the realm of necessity by avowing that it is the one of freedom, could it occur to falsify Marx's polemical concept of natural legality from a construction of natural history into a scientific doctrine of invariance. Yet this does not rob Marx's talk of natural history of any part of its truth content, i.e. its critical content. Hegel made do with a personified transcendental subject, albeit one already short of the subject. Marx denounces not just the Hegelian transfiguration, but the state of facts it occurs to. Human history, the history of the progressing mastery of nature, continues the unconscious history of nature, of devouring and being devoured. Ironically, Marx is a social Darwinist. What the social Darwinist praised, ironically, Marx was a social Darwinist. What the social Darwinists praised, and what they would like to go by, is to Marx the negativity in which the chance of voiding it awakens. There is a passage from Foundations of Political Economy that leaves no doubt that his view of natural history was critical in essence. Quote, much of the whole of this motion appears as a social process, much as the single moments of this motion take their departure from the conscious will and from particular purposes of individuals. The totality of the process does appear as an objective context arising by natural growth. It is indeed due to the interaction of conscious individuals, but neither seated in their consciousness nor subsumed under them as a whole. End quote. Such a social concept of nature has a dialectic of its own. The thesis that society is subject to natural laws is ideology, if it is hypostatized as immutably given by nature. But this legality is real as a law of motion for the unconscious society, as Das Kapital, in a phenomenology of the anti-spirit, traces it from the analysis of the merchandise form to the theory of collapse. The changes from each constitutive economic form to the next occurred like those of the animal types that rose and died out over millions of years. The fetish chapters, quote, theological quirks of merchandise, end quote, mock the false consciousness in which the social relation of the exchange value is reflected to contracting parties as a quality of things in themselves. But those quirks are also, it is true, as the practice of bloody idolatry was once a fact. For the constitutive forms of socialization, of which that mystification is one, maintain their absolute supremacy over mankind as if they were divine providence. The line of the theories which would become a real power if they were to seize the masses, this line is already applicable to the structures that precede all false consciousness and assure the social supremacy, supremacy of its irrational nimbus, of the character of a constituting taboo and archaic spell to this day. A flash of this struck Hegel. Quote, it is downright essential that, although the Constitution originated in time, it not be viewed as a product, for it is that, rather, which is flatly in and for itself, and is therefore to be considered divine and enduring above the sphere of that which is produced. End quote. Hegel. Hegel is thus extending the concept of some word in Greek to the one-time definition of the counter-concept of some other word in Greek. Conversely, the name, quote, constitution, bestowed on the historic world which mediated all natural immediacy, defines the sphere of the mediation, the historic sphere as nature. The Hegelian phrase rests upon Montesquieu's polemic against the archaically unhistoric common theories of the state as a contract. The institutions of public law, it says, were not created by any conscious act of will on the part of the subjects. Spirit as a second nature is the negation of the spirit, however, and that the more thoroughly the blinder its self-consciousness is to its natural growth. This is what happens to Hegel. Hegel's world spirit is the ideology of natural history. Hegel calls it world spirit because of its power. Domination is absolutized and projected on being itself, which is said to be the spirit. But history, the application of something it is supposed to have always been, acquires the quality of the non-historic. In the midst of history, Hegel sides with its immutable element, with the ever-same identity of the process whose totality is said to bring salvation. Quite unmetaphorically, it can be charged with mythologizing history. The words, quote, spirit and, quote, reconcilement are used to disguise the suffocating myth. Quote, accidents happen to that which is by nature accidental, and this very fate then is necessity. Just as philosophy and the concept will always make the aspect of mere chance disappear, and in it, as in appearance, will recognize its essence, necessity. It is necessary that the finite possessions of and life be posited as accidental because this is the concept of finiteness. This necessity has the form of a force of nature, and everything finite is mortal and will pass. End quote. Hegel. Nothing else had been taught by the Western myths of nature. In line with an automatism beyond the power of the philosophy of the spirit, Hegel cites nature and natural forces as models of history. They maintain their place in philosophy, however, because the identity-positing spirit identifies with the spell of blind nature by denying it. Looking into the abyss, Hegel perceived the world historic daring do as a second nature, but what he glorified in it, in villainous complicity, was the first nature. Quote, the soil of the law at large is the realm of the spirit. The law's closer location and point of departure is the will, which is free in the sense that freedom constitutes its substance and definition, and that the legal system is the realm of realized freedom, the world of the spirit brought forth from the spirit itself as a second nature. End quote. But the second nature, philosophically raised again for the first time in Lukash's theory of the novel, remains the negation of any nature that might be conceived as the first. What is truly produced by the functional context of individuals, if not by themselves, usurps the insignia of that which a bourgeois consciousness regards as nature and as natural. To that consciousness, nothing appears as being outside anymore. In a certain sense, there actually is nothing outside anymore, nothing unaffected by mediation which is total. What is trapped within, therefore, comes to appear to itself as its own otherness, a primal phenomenon of idealism. The more relentlessly socialization commands all moments of human and interhuman immediacy, the smaller the capacity of men to recall that this web has evolved, and the more irresistible its natural appearance. The appearance is reinforced as the distance between human history and nature keeps growing. Nature turns into an irresistible parable of imprisonment. The youthful Marx expressed the unending entwinement of the two elements with an extremist vigor bound to irritate dogmatic materialists. Quote, we know only a single science, the science of history. History can be considered from two sides, divided into the history of nature and the history of mankind, yet there is no separating the two sides. As long as men exist, natural and human history will qualify each other. End quote. Marx. The traditional antithesis of nature and history is both true and false. True insofar as it expresses what happened to the natural element. False insofar as by means of the conceptual reconstruction, it apologetically repeats the concealment of history's natural growth by history itself. New section, History and Metaphysics. At the same time, the distinction of nature and history unreflectedly expresses that division of labor in which the inevitable one of scientific methods is unhesitatingly projected on the objects. The unhistoric concept of history, harbored by a false resurrected metaphysics in what is called historicity, would serve to demonstrate the agreement of ontological thought with the naturalistic thought from which the ontological one so eagerly delimits itself. When history becomes the basic ontological structure of things in being, if not indeed the qualitas occulta of being itself, it is mutation as immutability, copied from the religion of inescapable nature. This allows us to transpose historic specifics into invariance at will, and to wrap a philosophical cloak around the vulgar view in which historic situations seem as natural in modern times as they once seemed divinely willed. This is one of the temptations to essentialize entity. The ontological claim to be beyond the divergence of nature and history is surreptitious. A historicity abstracted from historic existence glosses over the painful antithesis of nature and history, an antithesis which equally defies ontologization. There too the new ontology is crypto-idealistic, once more requiring identity of the non-identical, removing by supposition of the concept of historicity as history's carrier, rather than as history whatever would resist the concept. But what moves ontology to carry out the ideological procedure, the reconciliation in the spirit, is that the real reconciliation failed. Historic contingency and the concept are the more mercilessly antagonistic, the more solidly they are entwined. Chance is the historic fate of the individual, a meaningless fate because the historic process itself usurped all meaning. No less delusive is the question about nature as the absolute first, as the downright immediate compared with its mediations. That the question pursues is presented in the hierarchic form of analytic judgment, whose premises command whatever follows, and it thus repeats the delusion it would escape from. Once posited, the difference of some word in Greek and some other word in Greek can be liquidated, not voided, by reflection. Unreflected, of course, that bisection would turn the essential historic process into a mere harmless adjunct, helping further to enthrone the unbecome as the essence. Instead, it would be up to thought to see all nature and whatever would install itself as such, as history, and all history as nature, quote, to grasp historic being in its utmost historic definition, in the place where it is most historic, as natural being, or to grasp nature in the place where it seems most deeply, inertly natural, as historic being, end quote. The moment in which nature and history become commensurable with each other is the moment of passing. This is the central cognition in Benjamin's Origins of German Tragedy. The poets of the Baroque, we read there, envision nature as, quote, eternal passing, in which the Saturnian eye of that generation alone recognized history, end quote. And not just that generation's eye. Natural history still remains the canon of interpretation for philosophers of history. Quote, when history in tragedy makes its entrance on the stage, it does so as writing. The countenance of nature is inscribed, quote, history, in pictographs of passing. The allegorical physiognomy of nature's history, brought to the stage by tragedy, is really present as a ruin, end quote. This is the transmutation of metaphysics into history. It secularizes metaphysics in the secular category pure and simple, the category of decay. Philosophy interprets that pictography, the ever new mena tekel. I don't know if I'm saying that right. MEKE capital M-E-N-E, space, capital T-E-K-E-L, in microcosm. In the fragments, which decay is chipped, and which bear the objective meanings. No recollection of transcendence is possible anymore, save by way of perdition. Eternity appears not as such, but diffracted through the most perishable. Where Hegelian metaphysics transfigures the absolute by equating it with the total passing of all finite things, it simultaneously looks a little beyond the mythical spell it captures and reinforces. Okay, so that is the end of Chapter 2 of Part 3 of Negative Dialectics. Part 3 of Negative Dialectics is titled Models. Chapter 2 of Part 3 is titled World Spirit and Natural History, an Excursion to Hegel. Thank you so much for listening.